She was born the richest girl in the world, $1 billion, 5 mansions, a staff of 200 people. She had more money than most countries. And yet Doris Duke died alone, in a Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by people she did not trust. And to this day, nobody is entirely sure whether she was murdered. I'm Mary, and today we are going to talk about the woman who had everything money could buy and the dark, shocking secrets that money could never bury. Because what happened behind the gates of Rough Point changed everything. To understand the downfall of Doris Duke, you first need to understand what she was born into. On the 22nd of November 1912, in New York City, Doris Duke came into the world as the only child of tobacco baron James Duke. And before she had even learned to walk, the newspapers had already given her a name. They called her the richest little girl in the world. Not a nickname given with warmth, a label, a warning, a designation that would follow her every single day of her life. Her father had amassed a fortune of nearly $80 million by the time she was born, built on tobacco fields in North Carolina, on the American Tobacco Company, on Duke Power. The family lived in what could only be described as American castles. A home on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Rough Point, the summer estate in Newport, Rhode Island. Duke Farms, a 2,700-acre property in New Jersey. These were not houses, they were kingdoms, and little Doris was the princess of all of them. Her father doted on her completely. He took her everywhere, showed her everything, treated her like the most precious thing in his world. She learned to ride horses before most children learn to ride bicycles. She traveled through Europe before most children leave their hometown. She was educated by private tutors, surrounded by art and music and beauty from the moment she could perceive it. It sounds like a fairy tale, and for a few brief years it was. But fairy tales, as Doris Duke would learn, always have a dark chapter. In 1925, when Doris was just 12 years old, her father James Duke died. And a week later, it was revealed that he had left the bulk of his enormous fortune directly to his daughter. $100 million to a 12-year-old girl. But before he died, James Duke said something to his daughter that she would never forget. On his deathbed, he looked at her and said, "Trust no one." 2 words, from a dying father to his only child. 2 words that became the foundation of everything Doris Duke would ever be. She inherited the money. She inherited the estates. She inherited the empire. And she inherited the loneliness. Her mother, Nana Line, had only been left a modest trust fund, which immediately created a poisonous, strained relationship between mother and daughter. At 14 years old, Doris was already fighting her own mother in court to prevent the sale of family assets. At 14, a child fighting adults in a courtroom over $1 billion inheritance. When Doris wanted to attend college, her mother simply refused. Instead, Nana Line took her daughter on a grand tour of Europe, where she was presented as a debutante in London. Not educated, displayed, like a possession. But Doris Duke was nobody's possession. She used her money to travel the world, Indian mystics, African witch doctors, belly dancing in Morocco, singing in black gospel choirs on Sunday mornings in New Jersey. She studied modern dance with Martha Graham. She learned piano from jazz composers. She taught herself to surf in Hawaii, a 6-foot-tall billionaire heiress riding waves in the Pacific, shattering every expectation that society had placed on her. During her lifetime, she increased her father's fortune 4-fold. She gave away more than $400 million, often anonymously, asking for nothing in return. She was brilliant. She was eccentric. She was fiercely, defiantly free. And she was, underneath all of it, completely and utterly alone. The first crack in the life of Doris Duke came not from scandal, not from a lover, not from a court case. It came from marriage. In 1935, at 23 years old, Doris Duke married James H.R. Cromwell, a 39-year-old socialite who was rich, but not nearly as rich as Duke. His ex-wife had been Delphine Dodge, heiress to an automobile fortune. Cromwell, by reputation, had a taste for wealthy women. Everyone around Doris warned her. The marriage, they said, was a transaction dressed up as romance. Cromwell wanted access to her money, her name, her world. Doris either did not believe them or did not care. She was 23. She was free from her mother, and she wanted to experience life on her own terms. The honeymoon took them around the world, through the Middle East, through Asia, through the Pacific. And it was on this journey that something extraordinary happened to Doris Duke, something that nobody expected. She fell in love, not with her husband, with Hawaii. Duke arrived in Honolulu and was immediately introduced to the Kahanamoku family, the legendary Hawaiian surfing dynasty. Duke Kahanamoku, the father of modern surfing, took her under his wing and taught her to ride waves. This 6-foot billionaire heiress, who had spent her entire life being told what to do, what to wear, how to behave, suddenly she was in the ocean, on a board, completely free. She built Shangri-La in Hawaii, a palace filled with Islamic art, surrounded by ocean, designed exactly to her taste, for herself alone. It was the first time in her life she had created something entirely her own. But her husband was not interested in her paradise. Cromwell insisted on a guest suite he wanted to entertain, to network, to use her home as a social stage. Doris had built a sanctuary. He wanted a party venue. The marriage collapsed within a few years. They divorced in 1943. And here is where it gets complicated. Because it was not simply a bad marriage, it was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Doris Duke's entire life. Every time she let someone in, every time she lowered her guard, every time she allowed herself to trust her father's dying words would be proven right. Trust no one. Her second marriage was even more spectacular and even more disastrous. She married Porfirio Rubirosa, the notorious Dominican playboy, diplomat and polo champion, who was famous across 3 continents for his charm, his appetite for wealthy women, and his complete absence of loyalty. Their marriage lasted 53 days. 53 days. She had gone from the richest girl in the world to a woman who could not keep a husband for 2 months. The press savaged her. They had always been cruel, reducing her entire existence to her bank balance, treating her private life as public entertainment. Now they had fresh material, the failed marriages, the eccentric lifestyle, the reclusive tendencies. Duke loathed the press coverage and retreated even further from the spotlight, while Barbara Hutton, who shared the Gold Dust Twins nickname with Duke, seemed to enjoy the attention. Doris simply disappeared. She built higher walls around her estates. She stopped giving interviews. She became, to most of the world, a ghost. A ghost with $1 billion. Because while Doris Duke was retreating from the world, while she was building walls and cutting off connections and trying to live quietly, something was growing inside her. A longing so deep, it would eventually drive her to make the most shocking decision of her life. She wanted a child. In July 1940, Doris gave birth to a baby girl. The child lived less than 24 hours. She never spoke about it publicly. She never discussed it in interviews. She buried the grief the same way she buried everything behind money, behind walls, behind the silence she had perfected over decades. But that grief never left her, and 20 years later, it would come back in a way that nobody could have predicted, in a way that would set off the final, devastating chapter of her story. In about 15 minutes, I'm going to show you the moment that Doris Duke's carefully controlled world shattered completely. And what I found in my research, what happened at the gates of Rough Point on the evening of the 7th of October 1966, is something that has never fully been resolved. Not then, not now. By the 1960s, Doris Duke had settled into a kind of controlled isolation. She was 50 years old, twice divorced, childless, the richest woman in America and one of the loneliest. She divided her time between her 5 homes, surrounded by staff, by art collections, by the accumulated beauty of a lifetime of travel. But real human connection, genuine, equal, trusting connection, had become almost impossible for her. Because everyone wanted something. Everyone always had. There was one exception. His name was Eduardo Tirella. Eduardo was her close confidant and the curator of her estates in New Jersey, Bel Air, Honolulu, and Newport. He had been with her for a decade. And unlike almost everyone else in her orbit, he was not there for her money. He was gay, enormously talented, a war hero and Renaissance man who genuinely cared about art, about beauty, about the work. He was, by every account, the closest thing Doris Duke had to a real friend. She trusted him completely. In a life defined by her father's dying instruction, trust no one, Eduardo Torella was the one person she had allowed past the walls. Revelation 1. The career that changed everything. By 1966, Eduardo's Hollywood career was beginning to catch fire. He had been consulting on major films, and his work as a set designer was attracting serious attention. He had spent the last decade devoted to Doris's world, her estates, her art, her vision. But now he had a vision of his own, and he needed to follow it. He flew to Newport in October 1966 to collect his belongings and to tell Doris, face to face, that he was leaving her employ. Revelation 2. The gates of Rough Point. On the 7th of October 1966, at around 5 o'clock in the evening, Doris and Eduardo got into a rented Dodge Polara station wagon to leave Rough Point. Eduardo was driving. When they reached the estate's massive wrought iron gates, he got out of the car to open them. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe. Suddenly, Duke shifted to the driver's seat. The station wagon lurched forward, crashed through the gates, and pinned Eduardo Torella underneath it. He was dragged across the street and crushed against a tree. Eduardo Torella was killed instantly. He was 42 years old. He had been killed on the night before the rest of his life. Revelation 3. The cover-up. The Newport police conducted their investigation with remarkable speed. Merely 96 hours after Eduardo's death, the police chief ruled it an unfortunate accident based entirely on Doris Duke's sole testimony. 96 hours for the death of a man, ruled closed, based on the word of the richest woman in America. 8 days after being cleared of any wrongdoing, Doris Duke wrote a check for $25,000 to restore Newport's cliff walk, something she had always been firmly opposed to funding. 5 months later, the police chief who had led the investigation suddenly retired. The city of Newport received historic preservation funds. Colonial homes were restored. Doris Duke became the city's greatest benefactor, and Eduardo Torella was buried. His family was offered almost nothing. His sisters and brothers sued. A court found Doris Duke negligent in his death. The family received $5,620 each. $5,600 for a human life. Revelation 4. The witness. For decades, the case was considered closed. An accident, filed away. Then, in 2021, a man came forward. Robert Walker had been a 13-year-old paperboy at Rough Point in 1966. He told investigators that he had been present on the afternoon of October 7th, that he had heard everything, seen everything, and had been yelled at by Doris Duke 3 times to leave the scene after the crash. He said he had told fellow Marines about what he witnessed as early as 1973. The detective assigned to review the case found Walker to be credible. But the Newport police ultimately ruled there was no new evidence to change the original conclusion. To this day, the death of Eduardo Torella is officially an accident. And now the moment I have been building toward, the reveal that explains everything that came after. The decision Doris Duke made in the final decade of her life that would bring her entire world crashing down around her. After Eduardo's death, something in Doris Duke changed. She had always been guarded, always suspicious, always careful. But after 1966, the walls went up completely. She became more reclusive, more isolated, more distrustful of everyone around her. She was haunted by what happened at those gates, by the grief she could never speak about, by the loneliness that money had never been able to fill, and underneath all of it, that old grief. The baby she had lost in 1940, the child who had lived less than 24 hours. She had never stopped wanting a daughter. The biggest reveal, Chandy Hefner. It was in Hawaii, in early 1984, that Doris Duke met the woman who would eventually become the daughter she never had. Her name was Chandy Hefner. She was a follower of Hare Krishna, who had rejected her middle-class upbringing in Baltimore and was living on a communal farm when she was introduced to Miss Duke through a mutual friend. The two shared an interest in dance, Eastern philosophy, and animals. Doris Duke was 71 years old. Chandy Hefner was 27. Doris believed with complete sincerity, with the desperation of a woman who had spent 80 years searching for genuine human connection, that Chandy was the reincarnation of the daughter she had lost in 1940. In 1988, Doris Duke formally adopted Chandy Hefner, a 75-year-old woman adopting a 32-year-old woman as her legal daughter and heir. The world was baffled. Her lawyers were horrified. Her friends were alarmed. And they were right to be. Because Chandy Hefner was not who Doris Duke believed her to be. Their relationship quickly became strained. By 1990, just 2 years after the adoption, Doris Duke disinherited Chandy Hefner completely. What exactly happened between them in those 2 years has never been fully disclosed. But the outcome was devastating for Doris. She had opened her heart truly, completely opened it for the first time in decades. She had allowed herself to believe in something magical, something healing, a second chance. And it had collapsed. Again, her father's voice, always there, always waiting, trust no one. The butler. And here is where the story becomes truly dark. In the final years of her life, isolated and increasingly unwell, Doris Duke became dependent on one person. His name was Bernard Lafferty, her butler, a barely literate man with a drinking problem and a penchant for diamonds and Italian suits. He had become Miss Duke's sole confidant. Those who knew Doris watched with growing alarm as Lafferty's influence over her expanded. She changed her will, then changed it again, then again. In the last 3 years of her life, she changed her will 4 times. Each time, Lafferty's position in that will grew stronger. Hospital records and court papers show a disturbing portrait of Doris Duke at the end, taking several medicines, including antidepressants, painkillers, and sleeping pills. At least 3 doctors stated in affidavits that these medications might have seriously interfered with her thinking and judgment. A woman who had spent her entire life saying trust no one was now, in her most vulnerable state, trusting a man that almost everyone around her found deeply suspicious. The public and media were unaware of almost all of this. Intensely private to the end, she rarely wrote letters and shied away from interviews. What happened on the night she died is something that has never been answered. I want to stop here for a moment, because before we talk about how Doris Duke died, I think we need to talk about how she lived. At the end, by the early 1990s, Doris Duke was 80 years old. Her health was failing. The woman who had once surfed the waves of Hawaii, who had climbed 3-story scaffolding to clean the tiles of her own palace, who had danced with Martha Graham and sung in gospel choirs, that woman was gone. In her place was someone who barely left her Beverly Hills home. Someone who depended entirely on a small circle of people she could not fully trust, but had no one else to turn to. She had outlived most of her friends. She had estranged herself from family. She had disinherited the daughter she had chosen. She had watched the closest friend of her life die under the wheels of her own car. And now she was dying. On the 28th of October 1993, Doris Duke died in her Beverly Hills home. She was 80 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a stroke, but almost immediately, questions arose. One of Miss Duke's private nurses and one of her former doctors filed allegations that the butler, Bernard Lafferty, had conspired with other doctors and lawyers to murder Miss Duke with a drug overdose. The Los Angeles district attorney opened an investigation. The woman who had spent her entire life avoiding scandal had become, in death, the center of the most extraordinary one. Her final will left control of her $1.2 billion fortune to Bernard Lafferty as sole executor. If the will held up, Lafferty would receive a $5 million executor's fee, plus $500,000 a year for the rest of his life. The barely literate butler, the man with the drinking problem and the Italian suits. The law firm that drew up her final will had already billed the estate $13.5 million and stood to receive millions more. The legal battles that followed were extraordinary. Her earlier wills named different executors, people who had known Doris for years, who challenged Lafferty's fitness to control a $1 billion estate. The surrogates' court in Manhattan became the stage for a war over her legacy. Ever since her father, James Duke, had told her on his deathbed to trust no one, she had been suspicious of those around her, many of whom were sycophants and fortune hunters. And yet, at the very end, the woman who had guarded herself against the world for 8 decades had apparently been unable to guard herself against the man she had trusted most. Lafferty died in 1996, 3 years after Doris. The investigation into her death was eventually closed without charges. The $1 billion went to charity the Doris Duke Foundation, which continues to this day to fund the arts, medical research, and child welfare. And Doris Duke herself, the richest girl in the world, the woman who could not be loved without being taken from, was gone. She was buried quietly, without ceremony, without the fanfare that the press had always tried to impose on her life, just as she would have wanted. Before we close, I need to tell you one more thing, something I found that almost nobody talks about. Doris Duke gave away more than $400 million during her lifetime, anonymously, without press releases, without naming rights, without asking for anything in return. She funded AIDS research in the early 1980s, when almost no one in power was willing to even acknowledge the epidemic. She donated funds to support Black students in the American South who were disadvantaged because of racism decades before this was considered admirable by her social class. She helped create the Newport Jazz Festival, one of the first major platforms for African American musicians to reach a predominantly white audience. This woman, who the press reduced to a punchline, who gossip columnists used as shorthand for eccentric wealth, who history remembers mostly for scandal, was quietly, consistently, doing more good than almost anyone in her generation. And she never told anyone, because she did not want credit. She wanted impact. Think about that. The woman whose father told her, trust no one, spent her entire life giving to strangers, people she would never meet, people who would never know her name was behind the check. There is something almost unbearable about that. The richest girl in the world who could buy anything, who owned 5 palaces, who traveled the entire planet, found her deepest satisfaction in giving money away quietly to people who needed it, without any expectation of return. Maybe that was always who she was, underneath the walls, underneath the suspicion, underneath the silence. A woman who wanted more than anything to be useful, not to be loved, not to be trusted, just to be useful. And that, I think, is the truest thing I can tell you about Doris Duke. So what do we take from the life of Doris Duke? I have been sitting with this question for weeks, because her story is so complicated, so layered, so full of contradictions that any simple conclusion feels dishonest. She was a victim of a world that reduced her to her bank balance from the day she was born, of a father who loved her, but left her with a poison legacy, of men who saw her wealth before they saw her, of a legal system that valued her money over the life of a man who died at her gates. She was also at times deeply difficult, controlling, possessive, capable of cruelty. The evidence around Eduardo Torrella's death has never been resolved, and it sits in the middle of her story like a shadow that will not move. And yet she was also someone who gave hundreds of millions of dollars to people she would never meet, who spent her weekends singing gospel music in New Jersey churches, who learned to surf at a time when women of her class did not do such things, who funded AIDS research when it was still considered shameful, who restored colonial homes in Newport and Islamic art in Hawaii and jazz stages in Rhode Island. She was someone who wanted, desperately, to be more than the label she had been given at birth. She never fully escaped it. The richest girl in the world followed her to the grave. But here is what I keep thinking about. Her father's last words to her, trust no one. He said it to protect her. He said it because he loved her, and it destroyed her. Because a life lived by those words, a life of walls and suspicion and controlled distance, is not really a life. It is a survival strategy dressed up as wisdom. Doris Duke survived. She survived for 80 years. She accumulated more money than most nations. She outlived everyone who tried to take from her. But did she live? I think she lived in Hawaii, in the ocean, on a surfboard, learning from a man who taught her something no amount of money could buy. I think she lived in the gospel choirs, and in the jazz clubs, and in the quiet moments when she wrote an anonymous check to someone who needed help. Those moments were real. Those moments were hers. Everything else, the marriages, the scandals, the lawsuits, the butler, the $1 billion, that was the noise. The music was underneath it. Always. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Do you think Doris Duke's father was right? Was trust no one a gift or a curse? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story moved you, please share it. Because Doris Duke spent her entire life being misunderstood. The least we can do is tell her story honestly. Next week, we go somewhere completely different. A story from the heart of European royalty that ends in a way nobody saw coming. Subscribe so you do not miss it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.